Es una de las grandes figuras del arte del siglo XX como padre del concepto de y artífice de una nueva manera de entender la noción del museo. Puede decirse que ha cambiado el concepto de los museos con el modelo y modelo de las marquesas que tanto se utilizando últimamente en otros museos. Firmado internacionalmente en ciencias económicas y políticas, se especializa con posterioridad en arte. Como profesor en Wetlands District, encargándose del programa de artistas de referencia en el Museo de esta universidad. Trató de realizar el Museo de arte de Brooklyn en el 84, su idea para el Museo de arte contemporáneo de Massachusetts, que le permitiera más tarde a gran escala de la fábrica abandonada, es aún hoy un empleo que 10 años después uno de los proyectos museográficos más diversos. Desde el año 86 ha trabajado para la Fundación de Museo como director, teniendo a su cargo la creación de los proyectos de Bilbao, Berlin o el Guggenheim Berlin con las veas, siendo en la actualidad consultor de proyectos internacionales. La conferencia de hoy se celebrará en el Guggenheim Berlin, museográfica para Abu Dhabi, lo cual se encuentra en.
Gracias.
Well, not a good start. I stepped on my two speakers here, so I don't know if I'm wired, but we have a backup, so that's probably pretty good. I have no idea what I did. It looks like it's...
Oh, I see what you did.
What?
Right here.
Oh, okay. I knew there were too many wires here.
Excuse me.
There's two of them.
Yes, there are two.
Now I should be able to be heard in stereo. Okay, well, I'll do the best I can. If I can't be heard, we'll stop and we'll do something else. Okay, one more? Okay, good. I'm overwired. Anyway, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here in Madrid. The last time I was here was for the opening of the new building at the Prado, and I guess it's over a year ago, in November of 2007. And to see things settle down and to see what an extraordinary museum this has always been and how it's growing and becoming is really thrilling. And even though I've only been here for a few hours, Miguel Zugasa showed me his new next project, which is equally thrilling. So there's no doubt that this is one of the greatest institutions of art and art history in the world, and for me it's a great honor to be here and to address an audience. I apologize in advance for my utter lack of Spanish, but that's a reality that we will have to live with, and I will try to speak in a measured cadence and hopefully be understood. When this discussion, talk, lecture was first proposed, I think, by Paco Calvo, who I've worked with, he and Carmen Jimenez, for almost 20 years in projects at the Guggenheim. It was clear that the center of interest was the new Guggenheim project in Abu Dhabi, which has garnered a certain amount of critical press and international press, and there's a great deal of curiosity about it because very little information has been made available. So the idea of talking about the Guggenheim Museum in Abu Dhabi was the point of departure. But in the last week or so, as I began to think about this talk, it became evident, as it always does, that without some context for looking at this project, it wouldn't make sense. So I sketched together this outline, and I'm going to more or less divide this talk into 4 parts. I'm going to talk about what the theoretical context is for what the Guggenheim is doing and what lessons that has for other institutions around the world. To talk a little bit about how the Guggenheim enacted this strategy in the 20 years that I was at the Guggenheim from 1988 to 2008. And then I'll show you the project and talk about the project right up through actually yesterday, where we're continuing to work on it. And then all that will sound probably almost implausibly optimistic. And then I plan to end up on a decidedly downbeat tone with a doomsday scenario for what cultural institutions, particularly in the Western world, are facing. But to get on with the major part of this, I said part of it is context and crisis. And as I began to think about this and sort of what had motivated the Guggenheim, I was actually drawn back to a graph that I had drawn in the early 1990s, or actually it might have even been a little earlier than that. Although I've been in the art department, both the studio and art history department of Williams College for almost 18 years, and then the Guggenheim for 20 years. Actually, prior to that, I was an economist. I studied political science and economics, and I have an MBA, which either can be useful or a liability to a museum director, but it basically means that sometimes you think a little bit about the financial operations and where they might be going and how they might be funded. And as early as the late 1980s, it occurred to me that Western museums were operating in a very specialized landscape and maybe even a golden age where resources seemed to be available because demand for culture and cultural activity was growing. And this demand actually was largely fueled by massive investments in the West in education after World War II, both in Europe and America. In other words, put simply, there was a growing sophistication and maturity among the audience for culture. More people were interested in culture, more people in one way or another had studied art history. Museums were growing, and so the demand was there. But if you looked at the growth curves through the 1970s and 1980s, museums were actually expanding and growing at several times the rate of inflation. And what's counterintuitive or what's unsustainable about that is that that can't go on forever because you could apply a mathematical analysis to it and you could find that the entire gross national product would be devoted to culture at a certain point in the future if those growth curves sort of sustained that level. And the growth curves were also pulling up the expense curves, and it also occurred to me that the expense curves were at some point going to grow faster than the revenues because museums were becoming increasingly sophisticated. Technology was enforcing itself, professionalism in museological operations were enforcing themselves, conservation was becoming ever more sophisticated, greater investments of capital were needed for physical facilities, for professional training, and that sooner or later the red curve was going to get higher than the blue curve in that little green area up there. That's kind of like a situation that we're in right now, which has been accelerated by the world financial crisis. And you'll see many museums throughout the world, but particularly in the US, are dramatically cutting back on their programming and their staff because essentially they cannot afford to support the level of activity that they've been at. And I think that this condition has been brewing for a long time. As I said, this graph was drawn in either the late 1980s or the early 1990s. And there was a few bits of empirical research that could support some of the same conclusions. And this again dates from about that period. But the NEA in the United States is the National Endowment for Art. the arts, and it was founded under the Lyndon Johnson administration in the 1960s, and it grew very rapidly to the beginning of the Reagan administration. And from the Reagan administration onward, its budgets in real terms and in absolute terms have been increasingly less. In other words, the message here, which I also think in some sense, in some instances, is also happening in Europe, is that governments want to get out of the cultural support business. Governments still have an appetite for the infrastructure investment business because it creates destinations. But the real problem here is operating support. Governments are getting out of the business, and I believe corporations have already left, and individuals, particularly in the United States, are having second thoughts. And what all that means for the future of art museums, in my opinion, is some very, very difficult times. And this is not just a matter of years, but I think it may be a matter of decades. But I could be a pessimist on this, and so let's hope that that's the case. I'm sorry about these graphs. That's sometimes when you change technologies, the kind of like the types don't quite change. That's supposed to say concepts. And the point that I want to make here is that given that sort of pessimistic view of the 1980s, I began to look at, and I became director of the Guggenheim in 1988. My obligation and my job was to help my institution survive. And to help it survive, as I understood the environment where the government wasn't going to help, where private support was declining, and where corporations were uncertain, to me that was a kind of problem, is that where were you going to get the resources to do what museums deserved and what they needed. On top of that, the 17 years I spent at Williams, as I say, I started in the studio department, but I ended up in the art history department with a special focus on contemporary literary criticism as it applied to art history. And you could form some conclusions about certain things. And when I began to think about the museum, I formulated this statement that the public art museum is an 18th century idea in a 19th century box that more or less fulfilled its structural destiny sometime toward the end of the 20th century. As collections, particularly of modern contemporary museums, began to overwhelm the physical capacity of museums to deal with them, or even to kind of like collect intelligently. I also, somewhat as an outsider to this, didn't necessarily think of museums solely as sacred territory. And I was always taken by this notion, or this comment from Andre Malraux about how our museums conjure up for us a Greece that never existed. In the early 1970s, I spent 5 years on an archaeological excavation in southwestern Turkey, and everything that we dug up was painted. The sculpture, the columns, the architecture. But somehow when it made its way into a museum, it seemed to be this kind of white, pristine, sort of elegant alabaster, creamy shape inside a plastic box that somehow took it out of context. And it occurred to me that the whole environment of art museums is artificial to begin with. So that's an insight. It doesn't mean anything, but it just means that there may be other ways of looking at it. It also occurred to me that things change. In 1937, the Guggenheim Museum existed in an automobile showroom on East 54th Street in New York City, between Park and Madison Avenues. And 60 years later, the Guggenheim Museum in Bilbao opened. I mean, who would have thought that that was possible in that period of time? So things do change. And I've somewhat been a kind of, have an inclination toward institutional activism in trying to reconcile the opposites in the territory of the museum, in that I felt that at the beginning of the 21st century, it is incumbent upon art museums to act responsibly as agents of agitation, social information, and cultural change, even as they fulfill their traditional functions of collection, preservation, protection, scholarship, and presentation. With regard to objects of material culture. In other words, I think art museums should be able to do both. not just act as treasure houses and repositories for cultural information, but to take on a role that is more proactive in the world. And again, I apologize for the graphics because the key word is not here on the bottom, but this says, to assume that sophisticated contemporary art in the 21st century is the exclusive province of the North Atlantic is an unsustainable conceit. And that what we have seen over most of the 20th century is that culture is framed, accumulated, and presented largely in Western institutions to the exclusion of the rest of the world. And it's a very colonialist and even imperial attitude. Another insight is that cultural narratives are infinite and endless. And another one is that culture is biological, that our need for culture and the richness of our experience and the depth of our understanding of the human condition depend on the intensity of our encounter with art. I truly believe that, as I have sort of articulated all of these things. I think that these are components of developing a point of view and a strategy for an institution. And again, I apologize for the graphics because this is supposed to say audience matters, art is for the masses. That art is a social good, and it should be available to everybody without respect to any classification systems for which we're all familiar. That led inevitably, if you put all of this together, the notion of a kind of global integration, a global contemporary art, problems in how the world supports and funds these classical activities that had their beginnings in the 18th and 19th centuries. I mean, their institutional beginnings in the 18th and 19th centuries. You're inevitably led to some concept of the network. And thinking of the museum as a network of institutions rather than as a single institution was part of what lay behind the Guggenheim thinking. You know, networks are efficient, the content can be circulated, ideas can be exchanged, practices improved, costs saved, resources aggregated, mobilized, shared, dialogues enhanced, and knowledge and understanding can proliferate through networks. I mean, these days, this is kind of common knowledge. 15 years ago, before the internet, perhaps it was still somewhat of a radical idea. So those are some of that's what I said, this first part is kind of crisis and concepts. I believe that a crisis existed on the one hand, and that there were a certain kind of like cluster of beliefs that are in some ways kind of like captured in some of these first slides. So then to the second part of this, which is a quick view of the Guggenheim from 88 to 2008. When I came to the Guggenheim, it seemed to me that I made the mistake of saying that the Guggenheim had certain assets. I mean, the first time I said that to somebody in the press, I was automatically branded as a kind of heartless businessman who was only interested in real estate. But its assets in a general sense were its collection. It had one of the great collections of modern and contemporary art in the world. It had a great building, perhaps the most famous building in New York City, maybe the most famous building by America's most famous architect. It had good locations. You know, Fifth Avenue in New York, across from the Metropolitan Museum and the Grand Canal in Venice are not bad places either to open a store or a museum. And it also had an international brand and recognition, and about 80% of its collection was European at the time. The challenge was, how do you take those assets and translate those assets into a more secure future for the institution that somehow acknowledged a number of these concepts that had been developed. So a strategy had to be formed. And the strategy was to try to define the concept of the museum as a network, to pay attention first to the things that we owned, which was to expand and refurbish New York and Venice the best we could, to explore the possibilities of operational economies of scale, to build the collection, to build the program, to build the network, to expand the concept, and to extend the brand. I mean, those are all more or less sort of general and bland statements, but essentially they kind of embodied the strategy of the Guggenheim. And this was also layered with the notion that maybe we didn't have to think about the Guggenheim conventionally because other museums did that. In other words, the Guggenheim is not and was not an encyclopedic collection. I mean, the Metropolitan was across the street, and the Museum of Modern Art down at the other end of Fifth Avenue also did for the 20th century, from an encyclopedic perspective, what the Metropolitan did for most of art history. And the Guggenheim didn't have to do the same thing because we were in New York and it probably was redundant anyway, so we could begin to think about the museum in new and adventurous ways. And these are just some of the, I would even say, the mental processes that took place within the staff of the Guggenheim at the time. In other words, we were challenging ourselves to think outside of conventional roles of museum practice. And gradually, the specialized Frank Lloyd Wright alphabet with the single G for the Guggenheim became a kind of layer of Guggenheims as the network began to be built. And the metrics of measuring this strategy of success are the obvious ones. The condition and the scope of the facilities, the growth of the collection and the access to the collection by the public, the quality of the curatorial talent, the audience and the attendance that the museum generated, the quality of the program, the growth of the endowment, and the economic impact that its activities made on its surrounding environment. By now, most elements of this story are somewhat well known because certainly they involved Spain with the Guggenheim in Bilbao, but a new addition was added to the museum in 1992, and the Frank Lloyd Wright building has undergone 2 very serious renovations. We tripled the size of our exhibition space at the Peggy Guggenheim collection, which is on the near right, even though after 19 years we lost the Dogana to Monsieur Pinault. But nevertheless, the Guggenheim has a very strong presence in Venice. The Guggenheim in Bilbao, of course, has been the spectacular success story, and I can say without qualification that if it weren't for the Guggenheim Museum in Bilbao, I wouldn't even be here this afternoon talking to you. I would probably be in some other part of the world doing something else. But then the Guggenheim Berlin, which was opened 2 weeks after the Guggenheim in Bilbao, on a very prestigious location, Unter den Linden in the Friedrichstrasse, the former East Berlin, a very small space, but became a very powerful programming space for us. Then 2 spaces in Las Vegas, the Guggenheim Hermitage Museum and the Guggenheim Las Vegas, both designed by Rem Koolhaas. And then an alliance with the State Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg and the Kunsthistorisches Museum in Vienna. So altogether, the network by the turn of the millennia in 2001 now had 7 locations. And indeed, there was many of the benefits that we had envisioned from this. These were different institutions. I'd like to describe the Guggenheim as one museum with what I said was discontiguous gallery space. In other words, gallery spaces that were not connected. And there were economies of scale, and it was easier to raise money, and we were able to attract curatorial talent. In effect, all of the objectives and the metrics of the network more or less came into being. Over that period of time, the Guggenheim collection increased fairly dramatically by about 60%, over 10,000 objects. The Guggenheim Museum in Bilbao had an acquisitions program that we implemented very patiently over a 10-year program. And we've arrived at a point now where the Guggenheim in New York could more or less take its collection home if it wanted to, and the Guggenheim Bilbao would have the quality of its presentation and the quality of its collections would not be affected. And that's, I think, a very proud achievement for us at the Guggenheim, which is the potential or quasi-independence of the collection in Bilbao. And then we used the Guggenheim in Berlin, a very small space, only 500 square meters, but to do a series of major artist commissions. We've done 18 major commissions since 1997. They've all become part of the collection of the Guggenheim Museum, which are to be able to be used, and many of these pieces or installations by major international artists have been seen in Bilbao and borrowed by other institutions and used inside the Guggenheim network. Over that 20-year period, we did 292 exhibitions. Some of those exhibitions were controversial. We probably did more retrospective exhibitions of contemporary artists than any other museum in the world, I think, that I could calculate, and took on a number of challenging historical topics and formed alliances, for example, with Norman Rosenthal at the Royal Academy in London to do a number of major projects like 1900 Art at the Crossroads, Africa Art at the Continent, and others. So the Guggenheim essentially established itself as a popular and even populist institution with, I believe, a high degree of curatorial integrity. I think at one time, besides Carmen Jimenez and Jarmo Germano Chalant, Robert Rosenblum, John Hanhart, Nancy Spector, Lisa Dennison, and others, I think we had the most powerful group of curators of any contemporary museum that I knew of. And attendance was rising correspondingly. The Guggenheim now averages about 1 million visitors a year in New York, in a very small space, by the way. It's only about 10,000 square meters in total. In Bilbao, we have about 1 million visitors a year. At Peggy Guggenheim, about 500,000. In Venice, about 200,000. And in Las Vegas, we had about 200,000 to 300,000 while that was open. So we were approaching 3 million visitors a year, up tenfold from about 300,000 before we sort of started this strategy. And that proved to be a somewhat effective strategy for the institution. And then, of course, there's the special story of Bilbao. I mean, Bilbao not only was important to the Guggenheim, but I believe it was important to the Basque Country and to Spain. You know, it cost in total about a little over $200 million, with an additional $100 million over time for art acquisitions, but the benefits that it generated were enormous. 11.2 million visitors over the first 11 years, induced expenditures of $2.7 billion US dollars, tax revenues of more than $300 million directly to the Basque government. It created about 4,500 permanent jobs, and the value of the acquisitions, the $100 million that we'd spent when we had it evaluated last November, was $325 million. I think the point of this here is that you cannot separate the activities of the museum from the larger social context and the role that it plays in its both immediate social and political context. And it was also part of what the strategy of the Guggenheim was. If you remember, going back to that side, being a responsible agent of change and social agitation in a positive way, I believe Bilbao in many ways was the best example of that. Now that more or less sets the stage. I mean, that's the sort of the crisis, the context, and the first stages of implementing the strategy. The Guggenheim Museum, Abu Dhabi, what's that all about? That really began actually after 9/11, and 9/11 had an impact or an influence on this in the sense that I decided and convinced the Board of Trustees that we should look for an active engagement in the Middle East, is that now was the time to do that because culture had this ability, or it had this capacity, to initiate communication on levels other than economic and military levels. And that it also, it seemed to me that not only was the Middle East the cradle of civilization that we know it, and that has both influenced and shaped and motivated the West, had its origins in the Middle East, but this simply was a place that we had to be. And I remember that this began in late 2001 when Arata Isazaki introduced me to Sheikh Saud from Qatar, and Qatar and Doha were making a big investment in cultural activity at the time. And we began what turned out to be almost a 3-year negotiation that ultimately did not fulfill itself or go forward. But what it did was that it introduced us to the activity of the Middle East and what was happening there, the potential not only in the Middle East, but what could be happening as a result of what might be happening in the Middle East. Just to sort of pinpoint our activity, the little red star on the Google map is the location of Abu Dhabi, one of the 7 of the United Arab Emirates, but by far the largest. I mean, Abu Dhabi has 94% of the landmass of the UAE, 94% of the oil of the UAE, and the UAE has about 10% of the world's proven reserves of oil. So, rich country, small population, great location. Unlike Dubai, one of the Emirates up the coast, Abu Dhabi is a little bit more like Venice in the sense that it's built, or the city itself inhabits the largest of some 200 islands. So water is everywhere. They don't need to create it artificially. And it's almost an ideal tourist destination, particularly in its relationship to the Gulf. And of course, to the south is the empty quarter, the largest sand desert in the world, which has attractions all its own. But Abu Dhabi City you see this in the bottom left of the slide. The island that makes up Abu Dhabi City is about 30 kilometers long. It's about the size of Manhattan Island. And the population of Abu Dhabi City is 1.5 million people, although only 400,000 are Abu Dhabi City citizens. So there is a large expatriate population. The professional population tends largely to be Europeans, Australians, Americans, essentially Westerners. The labor population tends to be Iranians and Pakistanis, some Iraqis, and that's where most of they're involved with most of the building, obviously. And this island, Saadiyat Island, which means island of happiness, exists right to just off the channel from Abu Dhabi City. And Saadiyat Island is 29 square kilometers. Now, one of the virtues of this island is that it had a population of 1. I mean, there was only 1 house on it, which was at the very far end. I mean, 1 member of the royal family. But this was owned by the royal family. And from the early 90s, they had a plan to develop it. And 2 times that it tried to get started, it failed. And then in 2003, partially inspired by the example of Bilbao, they decided to give it another try, hired a firm called Gensler Associates to design a master plan, and they divided the island into 6 districts. A North Beach district, because that's one of maybe the most seductive beach I've ever seen, where turtles nest there. It's quite an amazing place as a beach. The cultural district, which is at the tip, the point closest to Abu Dhabi City, a marina district, which is in the middle of the channel, a garden district in the middle of the island, a South Beach district, and a wetlands district, because Abu Dhabi has the largest aggregation of natural mango groves in the world. So this is part of an environmental protection activity on the southeastern part of Saadiyat Island. We were initially approached by officials from Abu Dhabi in the summer of 2005. And this is just, I put this together quickly, a little chart of a timeline so you can see where we are here. By November of 2005, SRGF, which is the Solomon R. Guggenheim Foundation, had signed a contract with Abu Dhabi TDIC. TDIC means Tourist Development Investment Corporation, which is wholly owned by the Abu Dhabi Tourist Authority, which is one of the departments of the Abu Dhabi government. We had contracted with the TDIC to produce a cultural master plan for the entire cultural district. And it was up to the Guggenheim and it was up to us to sort of design the components of this district, to identify the architects, to recruit the architects. I mean, we didn't do this all in isolation. We worked directly with the Crown Prince Sheikh Mohammed, and it was Sheikh Mohammed actually who chose Frank Gehry to be the architect of the Guggenheim Museum eventually. None of the architects wanted to work in the Middle East because they'd all had bad experiences, particularly in the Emirates with Dubai. So it took some gentle persuasion to bring Frank and Jean and Tadao Ando and Zaha Hadid into the project, and 14 other younger artists from 10 countries to design pavilions. It took us about a year to produce the Cultural District Master Plan, which was presented on the 31st of January in 2007. Frank Gehry's contract with the Guggenheim in the summer of 2006, 2006 signed, I forgot to put this in, signed a memorandum of understanding to operate the museum, and we began negotiations in July of 2006. We didn't sign a final agreement until November of 2007. We began conceptual design on the Guggenheim Museum in July of 2007. This month, we will be finished by the end of the month with our 100% schematic design will be fixed, which means that the budget will be fixed, the parameters of the building will be fixed, the gallery spaces, everything will be fixed, then we get into design development and working drawings. Groundbreaking will take place in October, and we expect the museum to open in late 2013 or early 2014. So that's more or less the timeline. The Guggenheim's participation was in two parts. We were hired initially to do the master plan for the entire cultural district. And once the master plan was finished in January of 2007, our responsibilities were over at that point. And then we began negotiating for the Guggenheim Museum. So we've had a kind of I would not even say proprietary role, but we've had an intimate role in the evolution of the project. The objectives at the beginning of the objectives of for the cultural facilities was to have a Guggenheim Museum, a Museum of Modern Contemporary Art, to have a Louvre or Hermitage Museum, depending on the outcome of that negotiation, to have a performing arts center, and there were some discussions with the Mariinsky Theater in St. Petersburg and the Paris Opera, a national museum, the Sheikh Zayed Museum, a second national museum that focused on the industry of pearl diving, a Biennale park. Ultimately, we had 19 pavilions, to have artist installations sort of throughout the region and even the country, and then to bring in a major American university with a cultural bias. And there were sustained negotiations with the departments of art, music, drama, and architecture at Yale University, ultimately which did not resolve themselves positively. But this was the original plan. It took a certain amount of negotiation with the in the Emirates. I think it seems like I was going there every 2 weeks in the first days. That's Sheikh Sultan, who is in charge of the ADTA and the chairman of the TDIC. The Guggenheim Motorcycle Club was even called into duty, and we did motorcycle rides in the desert, of which this is one photograph. So we combined motorcycle rides and negotiations about culture in Abu Dhabi. And on the 31st of January, we unveiled our year's worth of work with a 1,200 square meter exhibition of the master plan for the cultural district of Saadiyat Island. I'm not going to take you through all of the components of the master plan, but the Guggenheim Museum, as you can see, had the most astonishing location, perhaps not surprisingly since we were doing the master plan. The Louvre by Jean Nouvel, Zaha Hadid's Performing Arts Center, Tadao Ando's Maritime Museum. This is the Marina District with buildings up to 60 stories high. This is the North Beach District, which will all be low-rise luxury hotels along this side. The Cultural District has a height limitation of, for the non-cultural buildings, of 6 stories, and that will be a combination of commercial, residential, and cultural activities. The Garden District begins around the edge of 2 championship golf courses, this one designed by Gary Player. The Wetlands District over here is all about the preservation of the mangrove swamps. And that doesn't quite look like that now, but I mean, it's basically the same concept. I mean, the Guggenheim, the Louvre in the same locations. Norman Foster has designed the Sheikh Zayed Museum, which is much more prominent in the location over here. One of the things that we got introduced into this, one of my sort of pet concepts, was the Grand Canal, kind of like a la Venice, which is right here, around which the pavilions, the 19 pavilions were going to be built. As part of our report, we did a study of 131 art biennales throughout the world, measured all of those in terms of expenditures, impact, cultural intensity, whatever measures we came up with. And then we decided to design one that was better by about 25% in terms of kind of a gross square footage and net space, or gross square meters. But that's another story. I'm not going to go into the whole Abu Dhabi concept. To show you a little bit, I'm going to show you an aerial view of Saadiyat Island. As I said, to give you a sense of this, the island itself is 29 square kilometers. The beach is 9 kilometers. That green line is where the airplane shot's coming up. I mean, I'm going to give you a view from the airplane looking back over the city. So what you'll see here is that you'll see Abu Dhabi city here in the distance. And it is an urban metropolis, no doubt about it. Saadiyat Island used to be nothing, and now, I mean, this was probably taken last January. Under the cloud over here, and I hope that's not a metaphor, is the Guggenheim Museum in the red circle. This is a 10-lane highway bridge that is going to slice across Saadiyat Island and go out to the airport to reduce travel time from the city. You can begin to see just the beginning of the Grand Canal entrance is sort of over here. It's the golf course down here. This is incredibly advanced since then. To give you a kind of like an overall scale of it, this red outline is Saadiyat Island. Actually, the wing of Saadiyat Island goes out here. So altogether, its landmass is about half the size of Manhattan in New York City. And the green box is the cultural district. This is just one shot of the 10,000 square feet or 12,000 square feet exhibition that we did, but it gives you a sense of the aesthetics of the exhibition, where we articulated the local context, the economic impact, the cultural vision, and then a separate gallery for each of the major architects, the Frank Gehry building, the Jean Nouvel building, Zaha Hadid building. This was the presentation to Sheikh Mohammed, who's the Crown Prince right here, on the 31st of January 2007, and this was the room where the new Guggenheim Abu Dhabi was presented. Of course, you see our prototype precedent in the background of the Guggenheim Museum Abu Dhabi, or the Guggenheim Museum Bilbao, and we devoted a whole wall of the Guggenheim room to the Guggenheim in Abu Dhabi. Now, to come to in Bilbao, back to the Guggenheim Museum. I'm going to try to take you through it in a very few minutes to give you a sense of why it's unusual. There's several things that make it unusual. First of all, it's very large. It's significantly bigger than the Guggenheim in Abu Dhabi. And one of the rules for Frank Gehry in the beginning was that he couldn't look anything like Bilbao. It had to be sort of completely different. So in other words, no titanium, no sort of curving pillow-like shapes that we saw in Bilbao. It had to be completely new and fresh. And we came up sort of almost bizarrely with this concept of these cones. I'm going to talk about the cones because they're really important here. Not only as an architectural element, but you can see that some of them are horizontal. Whoops, I'm mixing this up here. Some of them are horizontal. Some of them are near vertical. One of them is pretty close to vertical. But the cones themselves enclose 22,000 square meters. That's a lot of programmable space. And so what will take place inside those cones are commissions for contemporary artists. And that the commissions, based on our experience in Berlin, where we actually identify artists and then have curators work with the artists. We don't just accept what the artists do, we send it back for revisions and changes and ideas and concepts. But we believe that we can, with these cones, there'll be 13 cones in the final building, create a cultural experience that is, I mean, I would say virtually, if not absolutely unique in the world. So I'm going to come back to the cones in a minute. You get a sense of its scale. But here you see the location of the Guggenheim, location of the Louvre. You can see the Grand Canal in the plan, and all of these sort of gray shapes were the pavilions, but as I said, that's another story. The buildings that were realized in the plan, the Guggenheim Museum, the Louvre, the Performing Arts Center, Zaha Hadid, and the Tadao Ando building. Back to the Guggenheim, this gives you a sense of our site. That's me and Frank, it's a sweet picture. But that's the color of the water. And so this is going to be attractive. When you come to the Guggenheim Abu Dhabi, you can bring your bathing suit because the water is absolutely sensational virtually year-round. And that is, in fact, the site of the Guggenheim Abu Dhabi. Another thing that made it unique right from the beginning was an emphasis on both local identity and global identity. In other words, this is not going to be a museum that focuses on European and American contemporary art. It first and foremost will have a center for, well, we started calling it the Middle Eastern Center for Contemporary Art. But if you start to figure out the initials, that spells Mecca. And I'm not sure that we felt that we could do that. But anyway, there will be a center for, a Middle Eastern Center for Contemporary Art, which will give it, and hopefully we are negotiating the participation of 6 existing institutions of contemporary art in the Middle East. Most of them small, but in my opinion, all of them powerful. One is based in Cairo, one in Amman, one in Jerusalem, one in Beirut, one in Bahrain, and one in Istanbul. And the directors of these institutions, we are hoping, will form essentially the curatorial directorate of the Center for Middle Eastern Art, and that will have an entire floor of its own to be programmed by these independent institutions. I mean, we're going to have to see if we can make this work, but the idea here is that, and I think it's worth noting this, that, whoops, I keep making the wrong button here, but the Guggenheim Museum Abu Dhabi will strive to set the international standard for sophisticated contemporary art. It will reflect and represent a global perspective at the highest level, while simultaneously being grounded in and identified by the very best contemporary art of the locale and the region. GMAD's identity will be discursive and inclusive by definition. Art from every region and from every major cultural tradition in the world will be commissioned and acquired to build the finest universal contemporary collection in the world. To do that, as part of the first contract with Abu Dhabi, they've agreed to an acquisitions budget of $600 million and an indication that that may not be the end of it. Some of the points about this, and these are mainly just a collection of notes, but obviously we want this to be superlative, to be the apotheosis of contemporary museums, and actually to gather from the lessons of the last 15 years, to understand what is best about the Guggenheim Bilbao, the Museum of Modern Art, Dia Beacon, Mass MoCA, the Guggenheim New York, the Tate Modern, and then try to do it all in one place and to try to do it better. In other words, that's the objective here. What this might look like from a programming standpoint, you can see the Guggenheim Foundation here with New York, Bilbao, Venice, and Berlin, and then the various aspects and spaces of the museum. And I'm not going to call those out, but I will I will show you those as we go through this. And then the 6 institutions in the Middle East that maybe are partners in this. And then there's a capacity for other partnerships for other aspects of the museum. And Miguel, there's always an opening for the Prado here, so I could give you your own building or something like that if you'd like, or at least a fleet of galleries if we could work out a detail. And I see most of the important leadership of your board is sitting in the front row, so we'll have that conversation. But I thought this comparison might be somewhat useful, is that to compare the various exhibition spaces and levels of Bilbao and Abu Dhabi. The Bilbao atrium is about 900 square meters. The Abu Dhabi atrium is almost 4,000 square meters. The first level for permanent collection in Abu Dhabi is about 5,300 square meters, and Bilbao about 4,700. The second floor for changing exhibitions, well, you can see these numbers. And then I draw this line, and that's sort of where the comparison ends. In Abu Dhabi, there's a 4th floor, which has contemporary installations, another 2,200 square meters. The cones on the outside enclose 22,000 square meters of exhibition space. The sheds, which I'll show you, are basically an attempt to integrate the experience of Dia Beacon and Mass Mocha into an overall museum concept. And when I call them sheds, I mean they're factory-like spaces. Very simple spaces, rectilinear and not designed, which are part of the museum. And there are 2 pavilions of about 6,500 square meters apiece. One would be for art and technology, and one would be for architecture and design. So when you come down to a total programming comparison here, largely because of the cones, so let's not get carried away here about looking at it as pure exhibition space. But because of the cones, I mean, Abu Dhabi is significantly bigger. This was modeled in Frank's studio as a couple of days ago, and these are the sheds, for example, without the roofs on them. They're each about 3,500, 4,000 square meters, just of a factory-like space. You can see the proliferation of the cones. This is the scale of Abu Dhabi compared to the Guggenheim. Actually, Abu Dhabi has become a little smaller. It's now 86 meters. This is the floor plan of Abu Dhabi versus the floor plan of Bilbao. And now just to sort of take you through the museum experience very, very quickly, you will approach the museum. The security entrance will be here. Many of the activities of restaurants, theaters, and store and service amenities will be on either side of this long cone. This is about the size of the large gallery in Bilbao. And then you will come into the climate-controlled atrium here of about 4,000 square meters. The dark blue spaces are permanent collection, climate-controlled, traditional gallery spaces where we will do modern contemporary art like from 1960 to the present. The sheds are the artist in depth, and we will probably divide those. One would be Africa and the Middle East, one would be China and the Far East, and one would be Europe and the Americas, where we would basically showcase our collection as it develops of artists in depth. If you go up to the If you go up to the next floor, the purple spaces are all permanent or changing exhibition spaces, and the dark blue are special installations, permanent collection installations. So the purple is changing exhibitions. It's about 3,500 square meters. The third floor is the Center for Contemporary Middle Eastern Art. The fourth floor, more very unusual spaces. One of them is 25 meters high for artist installations. Give you a sense of the sort of profile here. I mean, this is all in scale, but this is one of the galleries. I think it's 25 meters high. That's close to the end of it. And I'm not going to try to explain these. This gets you a little bit of the flavor of how we're going about constructing the cones. I mean, these cones are gigantic. They're supposed to be made of glass. And we're trying to figure out a structure for it. And this is where this kind of design serendipity comes into it, where things that you never anticipate can come into the design process. that we know that we have to have some structure. If you use steel as a structure, it has to be coated with a fire retardant. But it turns out that a better structural material is heavy timbers, something like, I don't know, 1/3 of a meter by 1/3 of a meter. And to structure this whole inner shape here of wood and put the glass on the outside, you can see the proliferation of the cones. You see the scale of the cones. I mean, those are people here. This is Anish Kapoor's sculpture for the Millennium Park in Chicago. This is Saiko Chang's Inopportune One, which he did at the Guggenheim and at Mass MoCA. And to show you how we're designing one of these cones, which is that there would be if the structure is going to be made of these wooden timbers, then there would be some sort of structural plastic material, and then glass, which would be applied by brick after that to be suitably translucent. These cones are outside, but they also have to be somewhat air-conditioned, at least at the lower levels. And the interior of this shape of the timbers, the structural shape of the timbers, is absolutely magical. And you get a sense of the scale here. Here's the Klaus Oldenburg piece that was actually at the Guggenheim in Bilbao. And there it is in Bilbao. This is what the inside of one of the cones looks like. And it seems to bear a remarkable resemblance to one of the mosques in the Alhambra. So one of these sort of serendipitous accidents takes place as we go along. Anyway, that's the Guggenheim Museum in Abu Dhabi. But I hate to leave an audience on a high note, so I'm going to give you the bad news next. And the bad news will probably take about 5 minutes, but I think it's worth kind of like balancing these two things off. I think that the art museum industry in the United States is in difficult and if not desperate shape, in part because of what's happened with the economy, but not exclusively for it, because of it. You will remember this slide that I showed right in the beginning about that there might be a gap between operating expense and revenues. And I happen to note, and apologies to Maruk Tarpur who's sitting in the back, but I didn't mean to make the Metropolitan Museum a kind of primary example, and I might have looked further if I would have actually used Guggenheim stories about cutting staff back. But basically these were stories that were reported in the fall, or in the spring in the New York Times, about about all the museums that were, Google had 612,000 entries for art museum budget reductions, and stories on the Met, the Guggenheim, the Getty, Lockman, Detroit, Philadelphia, Atlanta, Cincinnati, da-da-da-da. I mean, there are a lot of them. And then you basically look at some of the things that were reported in various of the stories. It basically comes to the conclusion that endowments were down by 25 to 30%, and earned income and revenues from attendance and other things were probably not going to be sustained at the other levels, and probably corporate support had kind of like fallen apart. So museums were somewhat on hard times. But I wanted to take a look at a hypothetical museum model, and this is from an American perspective, where we don't rely on governments as much as we rely on endowments. So imagine a museum that is someplace between the Guggenheim Museum and the Museum of Modern Art, that has a $100 million a year operating budget, and has a $500 million endowment, and it has 1.5 million visitors a year. This would make it one of the elite institutions. I mean, it would have a very strong endowment, it would have a large budget, but it would have a high visitorship. And this is an oversimplification, but if you were to say for that $100 million budget that a quarter of it came from revenues based on that 1.5 million visitors, a quarter of it came from the $500 million endowment based on an expenditure rate of 5%, a quarter of it came from corporate and foundation support, and a quarter of it came from trustees, individual giving, and earned income. That's a simplification, but it's not an order of magnitude simplification. I mean, it's a reasonably accurate snapshot of an amalgamation of museum activities, and for the purposes of simplification, it's worth kind of like looking at. If in this new world that there's less tourism, for example, which we sort of see with the reduction of travel, of airline schedules, and new airplane orders. It relies on 70% of its visitation are from people outside the metropolitan area of New York, and a full 50% are foreigners from abroad. We have to anticipate that attendance is going to decline. If the endowment, because of the collapse of the stock market, is down by 30%, say it's 25%, but again, I said this is a kind of an order of magnitude. And corporations and foundations, I mean, my experience at the Guggenheim is that, we used to routinely get between $10 and $15 million a year in annual contributions from corporations. This year it'll be less than $1 million. That's a 70% reduction, and supporting big exhibitions is about as popular these days as buying a new corporate jet. In other words, I just don't see it kind of like coming back quickly because there's been a fundamental shift in the culture. And finally, individual giving. Everybody's feeling poorer, but it's not just that. I think that we live in a sophisticated world where the idea of transferring assets, I mean, the big beneficiaries of gifts of works of art that used to come to museums and now go through Sotheby's and Christie's, and back into the market and are resold over and over several times. But for museums, we're finding at least that private philanthropy is in danger, and that 20% reduction from a planning perspective, that might even be optimistic. So the budgetary impacts of this are, this is, as I say, this is just a hypothetical exercise. But the hypothetical exercise indicates that we have an unsustainable condition. Essentially, that cultural consumption in the United States, given its wide proliferation of art museums, is probably overbuilt and unsustainable at the levels that we've gotten used to over the last 25 to 30 years. And I think that it's a very serious condition. And I don't think that that's a condition that is dealt with simply by reducing staff by 8% or cutting out one exhibition program a year. I think it's a structural problem. And structurally, I think that, I think it's not going to be surprising to see certain institutions virtually on the verge of bankruptcy. Now, that raises an interesting issue. Let's say that the Guggenheim's collection is valued at $5 billion, but is listed on the balance sheet as $1, and the Guggenheim runs out of money. Is the Guggenheim bankrupt? I mean, you have to look at, what I'm suggesting here is not that museums should start valuing their collections or looking at their collections in a different way, but society is going to have to make some very hard choices about how it uses and consumes and takes care of and aggregates culture, because the present levels of growth over the last 50 years, cannot be sort of sustained indefinitely. They just can't. Look at the history of any of these institutions. So I tell this story at the end because you have to connect it to the beginning. And the beginning was when I talked about the crisis and I talked about the concepts, the idea of building a network and essentially taking advantage of the global spread of culture. What's happening in Abu Dhabi? Abu Dhabi is basically collapsing 2 centuries of growth into a decade. In other words, they have the means, and there are several, because that money's not coming from the French taxpayers. It's coming from the loan of expertise, of talent, and a very limited number of objects, actually, from the Louvre collection. But we've also noticed in the world that there's a shift in geography from west to east. You cannot ignore the population centers of China and India and talk about places that have culture and talk about places that have population. It seems to me that if there was a museum boom in Western Europe and in the United States over the last 100 years, that China and India are probably going to be next in line among other places. And you can't necessarily tell them to wait on this. And I believe that the new model that's going to emerge is going to have something to do with global collaboration. I don't know exactly what it is, but it's a model that we have to be aware of. So if you look at this in terms of capital and technology, that there is available capital for Abu Dhabi-type projects in basically resource-rich emerging countries. And the disintegration of the Soviet Union has basically unlocked some substantial resources in Russia, in Kazakhstan, in Azerbaijan, just to name a few. And some of that resource is going to be mobilized for culture, and they're not going to be able to spend 200 years collecting. And they're not going to be able to do what the Europeans did, which is to appropriate a lot of this material in the 17th and 18th centuries just by sending their ships to Turkey and kind of like, offloading temples that nobody wanted. And that the collection advantage, of course, is to the West, because they've been developing these institutions. As I said, the museum was an 18th century idea that really flourished in the 19th and 20th centuries. And so the technology is the advantage exists in the West. And somehow there's going to be a convergence of this, is that East and West is going to have to meet. And I'm basically saying that East begins kind of like in Eastern Europe and kind of like, moves in the other direction. And that the kinds of things that we're seeing in Abu Dhabi are not going to be aberrations, but they're going to be opportunities. I mean, they're not going to proliferate. They're not going to be hundreds of them. But I think that one of the ways that cultural institutions are going to address the current condition is through this kind of structured sharing of resources, of what you see in the Guggenheim, Louvre, and Abu Dhabi, because we're not doing this for nothing. I mean, we basically sold licensing rights, and we sold and guaranteed quality of programming and exhibition. In other words, we've engineered a large-scale technology transfer. And just like Bilbao, Bilbao is now in a position where Bilbao can be a fully independent institution. It doesn't need the Guggenheim any longer. It has a trained and absolutely first-class staff. It has 12 years of running a first-class program. It has a first-class collection. It has a surpassing building. If it decides to keep the Guggenheim name on the door, well, that's another question. But the point is that it could be off on its own. And other places and other countries are going to be wanting to see the same thing. So this is a balancing act. I mean, what I'm saying is that I'm very pessimistic from the standpoint of American institutions. I mean, most of them are not going to disappear. Those institutions with big endowments are clearly going to survive and adjust. But there are many, many institutions that are on the margin. And we saw some of that taking place in the United States last year. But I think we're going to see more of it going forward, because I just don't see where the resources are. So what are the conclusions here? Well, the conclusion at the end of the day, we'll go back to the positive side of this, is that culture has been thriving for 5,000 years. There's no need to think that it's going to collapse all of a sudden. It's not. It's just that there's going to be an adjustment. If you look at it from the standpoint of museums, it's kind of problematic. There is going to be a rebalancing, and as I say, it's not just taking place in kind of like culture. I use this quote that 3% of the world's population consumes 20% of the energy is unsustainable, and I'm talking about the United States right now, that has 3% of the population and consumes 20% of the energy. China and India, to use two examples, are simply not going to stand for it over the long run, and there is going to be a rebalancing here. So I think that there's similarities in culture. Globalization is inevitable, so you may as well engage it, and you may as well do it with the maximum amount of respect. And the development of new models that accommodate the aspirations of places like Libya and Azerbaijan and Kazakhstan, just to use a few examples, are going to have to emerge that bring their cultures and their aspirations into sophisticated contemporary global society. So, I'm done. Thank you for being so patient.